Hey everybody, Dawn Zoldai here. I'm the CEO of P3 Tech Consulting, and I'm so pleased to be here with OneTechWorld today to talk about how drones are taking flight. We're going to have a fun time, and let's go ahead and get started. So we can't have a briefing without an overview, so we're going to get right into it. Just give you a second to check that out. All right, let's talk about drones because you see this picture at the top, and what you see here are ground vehicles. You see very large, let's just call them flying taxis. And why do I have all these things in a briefing about drones? Because all of these things, autonomy, will be interconnected. And the key to drones taking off and really flying is having trusted, private, and cyber secure autonomy. And that adoption is going to be key for the future. So when you think about drones, you cannot think about them just in their own context. You have to think about automated vehicles, right? You have to think about electric vehicles like your Tesla. You have to think about uncrewed aircraft vehicles and underwater uncrewed vehicles as well. So many autonomous systems that are going to be working together. We have them on the civilian side or commercial side. You have them on the defense side. Not only that, add robots, add robotics and hardware, plus artificial intelligence and related software. All of these things are going to be key. And we're going to be talking a little bit about all of this. Now, when you look at the market today, and this is global, by the way, for UAS or uncrewed aircraft systems, we're looking at over 30 billion valuation today, but by 2030, it's going to be 55. You look at automated vehicles, we're talking 802 billion in the next couple of years. Those flying taxis I mentioned, looking at 110 billion by 2035. Even underwater drones are really starting to take off. So you see them at about 12.5 million by 2030. And then industrial robotics just doing great as well, more than 30 billion by 2027. So these markets are exploding and they are interconnected and autonomous. This is an eye chart, I know. But what this is a little snippet from this company called Droney. And what they've done is put all the different drone companies on one chart. By the way, if you look at the Vertical Flight Society, and they're the ones that follow these electric vertical takeoff and landing or eVTOL aircraft, flying taxis, if you will, their annual eVTOL directory is well over 700 aircraft, maybe 800. I mean, this is what we're talking about here, very significant. And the ones on this slide are some of the key players. All right, so I want to go through the top 5 issues we're seeing in this industry. But before I do that, I want to give a little bit more context because, the synopsis for this presentation talked about, what are the applications out there for drones in particular. And what I would say to that is literally the sky is the limit at this point. Of course, technically speaking, I think satellites are uncrewed and they're in space. But when you think about drones and what they're being used for today, we're going to talk about drone delivery in particular as one of the top 5. So, spoiler alert. But you think about long line linear inspections of pipelines. They're being used to inspect other critical infrastructure like bridges autonomously. We're seeing drones actually drop seedlings in the forest for reforestation. Drones are being used with little gadgets to help sample water. They're being used not only for things like light shows and fun things like cinematography and your real estate photographs, but also very serious things like precision agriculture. They're being used in greenhouses, in GPS denied environments to help determine seedling health. I mean, you name it, there's probably a use for a drone for that particular application. We're going to talk about drones on the battlefield here briefly, but drones are doing incredible things across the commercial space, not just in the United States where I am, but also globally, of course. Um, this top 5 that I'm gonna talk about here is primarily focused on the United States because that's where I'm from. But what I wanna tell you is this one right here, beyond visual line of sight, it's a really big deal. Most global drone regulations, and certainly in the United States, Part 107, for commercial drones, small UAS, which are less than 55 pounds, have to be operated within the pilot's visual line of sight. Why? There's no pilot on board. So, how do you know that it's not going to crash into something? That's why that rule is there. This idea of see and avoid, which is critical to crewed aviation, is critical to uncrewed aviation as well. But there is technology available out there, detect and avoid technologies, all kinds of different sensors. Like you think about if you have a Tesla or another, electric vehicle, they have all kinds of sensors to sense what's around them. Well, that's what's on drones too. And that's why beyond visual line of sight, number one, is possible, but number two is critical for repeatable and scalable operations. And what we saw over the last year was the explosion of beyond visual line of sight operations. Now, in the United States, basically what you have to do is get a waiver from the FAA to operate beyond visual line of sight. The same thing in most countries. There's a special certificate, for example, in Canada, in Australia, and I believe in Europe as well. But in the United States, these waivers are kind of blossoming, if you will. About 80 of the 134 waivers by the end of last year were beyond visual line of sight. So that just gives you an idea that the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration in the United States, and similar civil aviation authorities elsewhere are looking very seriously at this. In the US, they also did this thing called the Beyond Visual Line of Sight Aviation Rulemaking Committee. They had experts from industry, from academia, from government all get together under a specific charter to look at what should that rule be for beyond visual line of sight, because there is no BVLOS rule. There is a Part 107 small UAS rule, but there's not a BVLOS rule. So they put out a 400-page report. It's been about a year. Lots of different things, some controversial things like allowing drones to have the right of way around certain structures, which is very different from for general aviation and crewed aviation, like your commercial airliners. So a lot of pushback on that one, but no movement on that in the past year and just a bunch of waivers. And so the word I just got actually recently from the Association for Uncrewed Vehicle Systems International is that the FAA is not looking to put out a notice of public rulemaking or a draft rule until February of 2024. By the way, these slides I believe will be available to you, but that link at the bottom is an article I wrote about the Beyond Visual Line of Sight rule and the ARC report. So you can check that out as well. But beyond visual line of sight is one of those big deals, and we did see some movement, but frankly, not enough in the past year. I want to talk about commercial drones, commercial off the shelf drones. I'm a retired Air Force colonel, and I advised commanders about how to utilize drones in certain situations, including in armed conflict. And what we've seen here for the first time with the Ukraine Russian war is kind of unprecedented. I mean, small off the shelf commercial drones have been involved in conflict and terrorists have been using them as well. But they've been used in an unprecedented manner in this particular conflict. And what also is really interesting and different is that these drone companies are going outside of normal defense channels, working with nonprofit organizations to get drones in the hands of soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines for this conflict, which is also kind of unique. So, what is this telling us? This is telling us a couple things. Drones are here to stay on the battlefield. They're going to play an even more important role, whether it's surveillance and intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, to spotting targets, to dropping weapons, all kinds of things that you're seeing over there in the Ukraine and Russia. But it also has interesting implications to homeland security. If it can happen there, it doesn't take a large leap of imagination to realize it can happen at home as well, wherever your home happens to be. By the way, I have an article at the bottom here, and this picture is a gentleman from Rotor Riot. They make first person view or little racing hobby drones, and they were actually providing some of these to Ukrainian soldiers. So that's a picture of him showing his little tiny drone that they were using. The other implication to this is that counter drone or counter UAS is a super hot topic right now because we're seeing what we're seeing on the battlefield can certainly make its way to the home front. So let's talk counter UAS. It got a lot of attention. I think the Russian-Ukrainian war definitely heated up this conversation. But we've seen all kinds of things. We've seen drones flying around nuclear power plants. We've seen in the United States, a drone was found in Pennsylvania near an electric substation. The idea was that maybe it was trying to short out the electricity there. Drones have been known to cross the border with drugs. They're using drones to fly contraband into prisons. This is just in the United States, but it's globally. And again, the threat with drones is really only as limited as a bad person's imagination. Let's put it that way. To be clear, use drones in an ethical manner. But what we call those out there that might do bad things, we call them the clueless, the careless, the criminal, and sometimes even the combatants, right? So that article at the bottom is an article of that same title that I wrote for Inside Unmanned Systems magazine. So go ahead and check that out. But it's really difficult to counter drones. Not from a technological standpoint, but frankly, from a legal standpoint. In the United States, there's a whole host of laws, as an example, that were never written to deal with this issue, but have second order impacts on counter drones. Because if you're using RF spectrum, there's things like the Federal Communications Commissions, or things like the wiretap statute, the Pen Register Act, all kinds of criminal statutes that prohibit the monitoring of data, electronic data. And I'm sure in Europe with the GDPR, it's probably even worse, to be honest with you. This year, or excuse me, late in 2022, the Biden administration had a focus on UAS, and they put out a domestic counter UAS national action plan. That's a first. And it's basically calling for interagency cooperation to work together on these things. There were a number of hearings, a number of bills were proposed in the United States, and this conversation is still occurring. Right now in the US, there's only 5 federal organizations with the authority to do counter drone, and that means even just to detect and identify. I'm not even talking about taking something out of the sky or mitigating. And we're talking like the DoD, Department of Defense, the Federal Bureau of Investigations, the Department of Homeland Security, the United States Coast Guard, very, very limited number. So what does that mean? Our local police don't have the authority to do any of this. And so when you think about what could happen with a drone, it's the local police that need to be able to not only detect, but then to do something about it if something's happening in their local neighborhood. So this is a really big issue and a super hot topic, our third one that we're going to talk about. All right. The next thing I want to talk about is remote identification. It kind of ties into counter UAS because how do you know if a drone is good or bad, if you will? The drone itself is never good or bad. It's the person flying it or operating it. But remote ID is this idea of a digital license plate in the sky. Now, Europe has been, through their use-based regulation, had remote ID on board for a while. I believe Switzerland may have been one of the first countries in Europe to implement remote ID. But basically, to use a technical term, the drone beams out certain information through RF or network connections like Wi-Fi, right? So in the US, the final rule decided that it was going to be broadband. There was a legal challenge to that rule, which, by the way, took 2 years to finalize. Not the legal challenge. The legal challenge took another year on top of the two, and but the FAA came out on top. Um, in that lawsuit, it was alleged that the rule violated the Constitution. It was violating privacy by having this constant and persistent monitoring of drones and drone pilots, but the court found otherwise. It's a long story. I do have some of that story in the article noted at the bottom of this slide. The interesting thing is that last year in September, the manufacturers had to start putting remote ID on board their aircraft or adding these remote ID broadcast modules to them to sell them. And this year in the United States, drone pilots have to comply using remote ID compliant drones. And if they don't, they can only fly in certain spaces called federally recognized identification areas. A lot to be worked out, including the tactics, techniques, and procedures, some of the technology to not only broadcast it but to receive remote ID. A lot of things in the work, but this is a super hot topic that will continue to bubble along with counter UAS. And last but not least, I'd love to end on a happy note and talk a little bit about about drone deliveries because COVID-19 and that pandemic rocked the world, but one thing it did was show us that drones are really the ultimate social distancer. And when people were locked in their houses but needed medicine or even a COVID-19 test kit, using the drone to do that was something that really started to, for lack of a better term, soar and has been soaring ever since. And so, what we've been seeing is a lot of different companies across the world in Europe and Israel and Ireland. I'm thinking of Mana as an example. They deliver packages. The picture here is L site is the connection, and Speedbird Arrow. They're out of Brazil and the U.S. and they work in Israel. You're seeing Drone Up in the United States partnered with Walmart, one of our very big retail outfits. You've got Zipline, out in Africa delivering medicine, and of course in the United States also working with Walmart. Flytrex, all kinds of companies delivering packages, and the benefits are so many, including environmental ones you might never have thought about, like getting ground transportation off the roads and zero carbon emissions from drones. Huge environmental benefits, huge societal benefits. The challenges that remain are things like the ability to fly beyond visual line of sight and those approvals, protecting these good guys from the clueless, careless, and criminal counter UAS and other things. So, but we did see a huge uptick in drone deliveries, and I think you're only going to be seeing more of that going forward. Other things we saw was a lot of money flowing, right? And you see it like in the flying taxis and in the vertiport area. You saw some language changes as well. Things like unmanned systems became uncrewed systems to become more gender inclusive and things of this nature. So very positive things happening across the industry. So what's for the future here in the US? The FAA Reauthorization Act is coming due this year. I think we're going to keep seeing flight, beyond visual line of sight flights, crawling in the crawl, walk, run kind of scheme. More and more drone deliveries. We're going to see remote ID become real robust. Counter UAS, I think, is going to move forward. Lots of research and developments going on. And I think some industry consolidation as the money starts to tighten in 2023. Please plug in and learn more. I've got 3 different podcasts. You see the Dawn of Drones here. Go to my website, P3 Tech Consulting. It's going to be on the next slide. I do conference content, webinars. I write for a lot of different magazines, and that's my Law Tech Connect workshop. I'm doing 2 of those this year, one with AUVSI actually in May. And then here's how you connect with me. There's my website, my LinkedIn, all my podcasts flow across it. Please connect with me there. And then my link tree has all of my social handles. Well, that's all she wrote. We're at 20 minutes. I knew this flew by, but it was so great to talk to you about how drones are taking flight.